Hope you're doing well this morning. And yeah, as I said, we're on our final session today. So we're going to be, as I posted in the chat, we're going to be looking at SAT Practice Test 10. There's a link to download the PDF in the chat. We'll be looking at the first passage in the reading comp section. Let me just get the page number for you. Yes, so it will be on page 298. Much closer to the start of your book than most of the tests we've been looking at. Page 298, SAT Practice Test 10. And we've spent a lot of time going over, the differences in graphs and how data can be interpreted in different ways on the SAT. Sometimes you're being asked to edit the passage itself, like in the writing and language passage. You're being asked to, include information from the graph that's relevant to the main point and also accurate to the data you're being shown. Sometimes you are being given a graph, as in the reading comprehension section, and being asked, hey, just interpret this data. What does this seem to actually be showing me? Well, I thought we'd end with something a little bit different. That we'd end with a narrative fiction passage. And I know we've done these before, but I think it's important to demonstrate again how evidence still shows up, even when it's not explicitly graphed out. There are still ways to look for evidence that may not be as initially obvious as if the axes were labeled or whatever. So again, we're going to be looking at SAT Practice Test 10, and I'll share my screen with you right now, and we can get started. So please remember, if you're having any sort of any questions coming up, anything I'm saying that's not quite making sense, please just drop a question in the chat, and I'll do my best to address it. So this is on page 298 of the Big Blue Book. It's the start of SAT Practice Test 10. As you know by now, you're probably sick of hearing me say it, so I'm just going to say it one final time. What's the first thing we do when we reach a reading comprehension passage? We read the blurb. That's right. But the blurb gives us very little information for the narrative fiction, but still some. So the passage is adapted from Mary Helen Stefaniak, The Caliphs of Baghdad, Georgia, a novel. Now, this doesn't tell us a lot, right? But by the fact that it's not telling us much, it is actually telling us a good deal. First of all, it is telling us the kind of passage we're getting into. We're getting into a narrative fiction passage because we know this is coming from a novel. And since all we're being given is like the publication date and the title, and there's no clear like statement of research intent in this title, right? And there's not a whole lot of historical context being given, like might be the case in a historical passage. We can safely assume that what we're about to encounter is fiction. So we've established that it's fiction. What are we doing next? Well, next we're going to want to sandwich the passage, right? So let's skim about, see if we can't get the basic idea of what's going on here. Miss Grace Spivey arrived in Three-Step, Georgia in August 1938. All right, so what I like to do is I definitely like to, oh hey, what in the world am I doing? Why am I sandwiching the passage? I mean, we can sandwich the passage now. We can also start sort of doing that helicopter view. Let's skip ahead to the helicopter view. We'll come back to you, Miss Grace Spivey. You seem pretty important though, so I'll underline you. We can categorize these questions without much trouble though. Okay, so the narrator of the passage can best be described as, well, oh, you know what? I'm in the wrong tab here. But that seems like a broad question, right? We're being asked a sort of general question about what the character of the narrator is. So sometimes the narrator is going to be like a detached third person omniscient kind of thing, but sometimes it's going to be a character in the story telling the story. So that would be broad. We're going to save that for last. Let's look at number 2 here. In the passage, 3-step is mainly presented as, well, we're being asked about that town of 3-step, Georgia, right, that we saw in that first sentence. But again, because there's not a reference to a particular line in the passage, I would categorize this as broad as well. Number 3, it can reasonably be inferred from the passage that some of the people at the train station regard Miss Spivey's comment about the Georgia heat with, okay, some interesting key words there. Now this looks like a broad passage at first, or a broad question at first. Let's see where it goes. Is there any connecting questions? Son of a gun, there is. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So these two are definitely connected and definitely both line questions. So we're going to answer those before we get to the broad ones, but we probably won't answer them first. Miss Spivey most likely uses the phrase fruitful intermission, line 26, to indicate what? Well, okay, we were being given a line here. So I would say this is for sure a line question of some kind. It's also almost a vocab and context question, right? We're being given a phrase and being asked, what does this phrase mean in that context? But we're being asked less about the phrase's meaning and more about the speaker's intent here, right? So I would say that's still technically a line question, not a vocab and context. But remember, these categories only serve as helpful markers to decide which ones we're going to answer first. They're not hard and fast rules, but they are general guidelines. The interaction between Miss Spivey and Ralford serves mainly to, okay, well, that seems like sort of a broad question because we're talking about one interaction and what it serves the passage overall. But it is sort of a line question because we're being asked about one in particular portion. So I would still call this broad, but keep in mind that there's a focus on one particular interaction. In the third paragraph, okay, right away, we know what we're being asked here. Specific lines, specific references, definitely a line question. So on test day, I would just mark a little L on there to remind me. According to the passage, holy moly, another broad question. Miss Spivey ended up in 3-step as a direct result of what? Okay, well, we're going to hopefully get a better idea of that as we go on. In the passage, when Miss Spivey announces that she had seen camels, the student's reaction suggests that they are. Okay, so looks broad. However, we are looking at a very particular point. So it's going to have to do with this particular thing, when Miss Spivey announces that she had seen camels. And as we keep scrolling down, we see that these two are connected. So not only do we have it narrowed down to whatever Miss Spivey is saying about camels, but we have it narrowed down to one of these 4 points of evidence. And that brings us to the end. So let's sandwich the passage and see if we can't get a better idea of what's going on for Miss Spivey in Three-Step Georgia. So Miss Grace Spivey arrived in Three-Step Georgia. Now we know that both of those things are important now. In August 1938. She stepped off the train wearing a pair of thick-soled boots suitable for hiking, a navy blue dress, and a little white tam that rode the waves of her red hair at a gravity-defying angle. Okay, we probably wasted some time reading that description, but maybe not. Let's just leave this here for now. Move on to the end of the paragraph. Hard times were still upon us in 1938, but like my mama said, we weren't no poorer than we'd ever been, and the citizens of Three-Step were in the mood for a little excitement. Miss Spivey, and again, I like to underline when I see a character's name or circle it, just so I can keep track of who's saying what. Miss Spivey looked like just the right person to give it to them, it being excitement. Okay, and then we get into some more description of Miss Spivey that may be important later, but it's not important to us now. When my little brother Ralford, okay, that name looks familiar, asked what did she study at Barnyard College, Miss Spivey explained that Barnard, which she wrote on the blackboard, was the sister school of Columbia University, of which she expected we had all heard. All right, so we've got Ralford's appearance right there. It was there, she told us, in the midst of trying to find her true mission in life, that she wandered one afternoon into a lecture by the famous John Dewey, another character, who was talking about his famous book, Democracy and Education. All right, let's keep moving forward here. Two years later, she told a cheery blue-suited woman from the WPA that she wanted to bring democracy and education to the poorest, darkest, most remote and forgotten corner of America. They sent her to Three-Step Georgia. Okay, some more information about Three-Step Georgia. And if we're curious, we might be like, okay, well, what's the WPA? Of course, we've got a footnote here. That was the Works Progress Administration, a government agency that hired people for public and cultural development projects and services. Okay, so the people who hired her sent her to Three-Step Georgia when she said she wanted to go to a desolate place. More about Ralford. It's a name I've never heard outside of this passage, by the way, but it's the 30s. What we really wanted to know about, all 26 of us, okay, so this seems key. All 26 of us across 7 grade levels in the one room was the pearly white button hanging on a string in front of the blackboard behind the teacher's desk up front. That button on a string was something new. Okay, we'll get to that later, but we definitely have another character here, Mavis Davis. I can even skim for names. All right, there's Miss Chandler. Miss Spivey showed us on the map how she and Dr. Janet Miller had sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and past the Rock of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean Sea. Cool. Not sure if that'll be useful or not yet, right? And can you guess what we saw from the train, Miss Spivey asked? We could not. Camels, she said. We saw a whole caravan of camels. Okay, that's a highlight of her trip there. She means like the 3 kings rode to Bethlehem, Mavis said. There's our pal Mavis. And now let's just read the final paragraph here. Miss Spivey made a mistake right then. Well, that seems like we're getting into something important. Instead of beaming upon Mavis the kind of congratulatory smile that old Miss Chandler would have bestowed on her for having enlightened the rest of us, Miss Spivey simply said, "That's right." Okay. All right, so we're getting a little glimpse into the politics of the one-room schoolhouse being shown here. But let's start at the beginning. Now, we don't seem to have, again, where we would usually start is the vocab in context. Now, we don't have any like outright vocab in context, so let's start with the next best thing. Miss Vivi most likely uses the phrase fruitful intermission in line 26 to indicate what? All right, well, let's look at line 26. There we go. And let's read the whole sentence in context. She'd gone to boarding school since she was 6 years old, and during what she called a fruitful intermission in her formal education, she had traveled extensively in the Near East and Africa with a friend of her grandmother's, one Janet Miller, who was a medical doctor from Nashville, Tennessee. Okay, so if we're familiar with the phrase intermission, we'll know that that just means a break. Like for those of you who are in theater, you'll probably know that intermission is the break between usually the first and the second act of a play. Gives people a chance to get up and go to the bathroom or do whatever they need to do. And you can probably tell that, like, all right, well, what does it mean if something's fruitful? We usually don't mean like literal fruit being had, right? But fruit as a metaphor for something gained, right? So it was a break from her formal education, but it was still a very beneficial break. She wasn't just, she wasn't just lying down and relaxing. So what best fits our answer here? A, she benefited from taking time off from her studies in order to travel. Well, that seems like a humdinger of an option so far. B, her travels with Janet Miller encouraged her to start medical school. I don't see that. Her early years at boarding school resulted in unanticipated results. Well, no, boarding school would be formal education, right? What she thought would be a short break from school lasted several years. Well, fruitful doesn't necessarily mean long. And if she traveled extensively, yeah, it doesn't really say how long this intermission was. And here, while we do see Janet Miller was a medical doctor, we don't really see Miss Spivey go on into medicine, right? We know that she goes on into education. That's why she's here. So it's not long. It didn't lead to medical school. I would say A is our option. She benefited from this time off. Now let's look at our line questions, give ourselves some more context here. So it can reasonably be inferred from the passage, and remember, we're looking for key words here, from the passage that some of the people at the train station regard Miss Vivi's comment about the Georgia heat with, okay, so we need, it has to be about the people at the train station, and it has to be about how they regard, how they think or feel about Miss Vivi's comment about the Georgia heat. If it doesn't hit all three of those points, we're not interested. Now we know it's going to be in one of these four places. So let's start at lines 2 through 5. Right, starting with she stepped and ending with angle. She stepped off the train wearing a pair of thick-sole boots suitable for hiking. Oh yeah, we read this. This is just all describing her physically. Little white tan that rode the waves of her red hair at a gravity-defying angle. Well, that has nothing to do with her comments about the heat. Has nothing to do with anything, really. Crossing it out. Lines 10 to 14, starting with I believe and ending with else. I believe her remark irritated some of the people gathered to welcome her on the burned grass alongside the tracks. No, it keeps going. When folks are sweating through their shorts, they don't like to hear that this is nothing compared to someplace else. Okay, well, this is definitely about the people at the train station. They're definitely reacting to, well, what did she say here? August was a hellish month to step off the train in Georgia, although it was nothing, she said, compared to the 119 degrees that greeted her when she arrived one time in Timbuktu, which she assured us was a real place in Africa. Okay, so Miss Vivian made a comment about the heat. The people here aren't happy about it. I think B is our best option so far. Let's look at the other ones just to build context. Irritated or not, the majority of those present were inclined to see the arrival of the new school teacher in a positive light. Well, okay, that's not a reaction to her comment about the heat. Oh, it does keep going though, all the way to line 20, which we already read. Hard times were still upon us in 1938, but like my mama said, we weren't no poorer than we'd ever been, and the citizens of Three Step were in the mood for a little excitement. Doesn't have to do with what we're concerned about. Lines 23 to 25, starting with she'd gone and ending with London. She'd gone to boarding school since she was 6 years old. She'd studied French in Paris and drama in London. Cool facts, but doesn't have anything to do with the people at the train station. B is our best option. And if you were pressed for time, you can always just go with this guess. You know, it's more than a guess. Like it's more of you've done the work, you've looked for the evidence. But I just want to give you the permission. If you're pressed for time on test day, you don't have to double check. This just kind of helps add that extra assurance. If you get something that's just like a home run right away, you know, in the best of circumstances, I'd still recommend you check those other answers. But if you're pressed for time and you're like, this is it, then yeah, if you know, just keep going with it. So what is the reaction of the people at the train station to Miss Vivi's comment about the heat? Well, they're not too happy. They're irritated, right? Irritated, some of the people gathered to welcome her because, you know, they're really uncomfortable. They're sweating through their shorts. They don't like to hear that, you know, it's nothing compared to somewhere else. You all probably have a friend like that, just like, oh my gosh, you think this is cold? I'm from Alaska. I don't know if you all have a friend from Alaska, but if you do, you probably hear stuff like that. So they are irritated. What are some synonyms for irritated? Well, we might say bothered, we might say annoyed, frustrated, that sort of thing. Let's see if we come up on any of those here. Sympathy. No, they're not sympathizing with her, and she's let them know that this is not her first time experiencing intense heat. Disappointment, because they doubt she will stay in Three Step for very long. I don't see that, no, for sure. Embarrassment, because they imagine that she is superior to them. Closer, but I don't think that that's really the power dynamic going on. Like, being embarrassed and being irritated are very different emotions. Resentment, because they feel that she is minimizing their discomfort. Yeah, that seems like the closest one. They're unhappy with her because she's saying like, yeah, you're uncomfortable, but hey, this is nothing compared to Timbuktu. Nice little lesson in empathy there. Okay, so let's look at some more line questions here. Let's look at this third paragraph, because this is sort of a line question. What is the narrator most likely suggesting by describing Miss Spivey as having wandered in line 40 and marched in line 49? Well, let's find those words. You'll probably want to read that whole third paragraph. It was there, she told us, starting on line like 39, in the midst of trying to find her true mission in life, that she wandered one afternoon into a lecture by the famous John Dewey, who was talking about his famous book, Democracy and Education. Professor Dewey was in his 70s by then, Miss Vivi said, but he still liked to chat with students after a lecture, especially female students, she added, sometimes over coffee, and see in their eyes the fire his words could kindle. It was after this lecture and subsequent coffee that Miss Vivi had marched to the Teachers College and signed up, all aflame. 2 years later, she told a cheery blue-suited woman from the WPA, as we read before, she wanted to bring democracy to these poor, dark, remote, forgotten places. Senator three-step. So she wandered into this lecture by John Dewey, has a conversation with John Dewey. It's sort of, we see these metaphors of fire. The fire his words could kindle. And she was all aflame. So she has purpose here, right? That fire is sort of the metaphor of purpose and excitement. And here she just kind of happens to, she's trying to find her true mission in life. She's sort of directionless, both literally and metaphorically, when she wanders into this lecture by John Dewey. So she had, no purpose over here. By the time she talks with John Dewey, she has purpose going to the WPA, or going to the Teachers College, rather. So what is the narrator suggesting here? Dewey, knowing Miss Vivi wasn't very confident in her ability to teach, instilled in her a sense of determination. Well, I like the latter half of that, but I don't know if Dewey knew that Miss Vivi wasn't very confident, or even if Miss Vivi was unconfident. So let's mark it, see if we come up with anything better. Talking with Dewey over coffee made Miss Vivi realize how excited she was to teach in the poorest, most remote corner of America. That's better than A. Because, right, remember what we're being asked about. We're being asked about the words wandered and marched. Those don't have to do with Dewey. It has to do with Miss Vivi. So it made her realize how excited she was. Now, she doesn't come to that realization right away. Remember, she comes to it like 2 years later. She marches to the Teachers College right away, and then 2 years later, she wants to go to these dark remote corners. So let's mark that. After 2 years spent studying, Miss Vivi was anxious to start teaching and be in charge of her own classroom. That's true. However, the marching does not happen after her 2 years spent studying. The 2 years later comes here, after any wandering and marching is already complete. Slash that. Miss Vivi's initial encounter with Dewey's ideas was somewhat accidental, but ultimately motivated her to decisive action. I think that's our money, right? That's the answer. She was directionless when she found Dewey, but she was motivated when she left their conversation. B is just not as strong a case because she doesn't come to that conclusion right away. All right, now we have some other line questions. In the passage, when Miss Vivi announces that she had seen camels, the student's reaction suggests they are what? Well, we know it's got to be somewhere in here, and it has to be about Miss Vivi talking about camels, and it has to be about the student's reaction to that, right? So let's look at which one most has to do with with these few components. Option A, lines 82 to 84, starting with she looked and ending with thought. '82 to 84. I always like lose track, even in that short interval of just going back and forth. All right, 82 to 84. She looked around the room, waiting for us to be amazed and delighted at the thought. Okay, so what is she waiting for? She's waiting for their reaction to the caravan of camels. All right, that definitely has to do with camels. Definitely has to do with their reaction. So let's mark that for now. B, lines 85 to 86, starting with we all and ending with up. We all hung there for a minute, thinking hard, until Mavis Davis spoke up. Okay, so this is more about Miss Spivey waiting for the reaction. That's the reaction she expects, right? Amazement and delight. And the reaction she gets back is them just kind of thinking, hanging there. Now, Mavis Davis seems to know what's going on, but so far I like B better than A. '87 to '90, starting with she means and ending with room. All right, Mavis is going to speak up. She means like the Three Kings or to Bethlehem, Mavis said, as she folded her hands smugly on her 7th grade desk in the back of the room. Well, okay, like good for Mavis, but that doesn't seem to be the reaction of the students at large. So I don't like C. D, 91 to 95, starting with instead and ending with right. Instead of beaming down upon Mavis the kind of congratulatory smile that old Miss Chandler would have bestowed on her for having enlightened the rest of us, Miss Spivey simply said, "That's right." Well, that has to do with Miss Spivey's reaction to Mavis's reaction. That doesn't actually have to do with the class's reaction to Miss Spivey's statement. Boom, we've narrowed it down already. So based on option B, what are they doing here? They're hanging there for a minute, thinking hard. So apparently they don't really know what she's talking about, right? She's waiting for them to be amazed and delighted at the thought, but everyone's just like, yeah, camels, I know what that is. Give me a minute. So what most describes that reaction? Delighted. Well, no, that's what she wants them to be. Fascinated. Again, no. Sorry, Miss Spivey. Baffled. Yeah, that seems to be the best one. They're not worried. Like she's not telling them camels are coming, beware. They just don't know what they are. So they're confused. Baffled is another word for that. Do we have any other line questions lingering around? Well, we do have this interaction between Miss Spivey and Ralford, so that's a little more specific than the whole passage. Now, in case we forget, this was the interaction. So let's look at the sentence before it for context. After her travels with Dr. Miller, Miss Spivey continued her education by attending Barnard College in New York. She told us all that at school the first day. When my little brother Ralford asked what did she study at Barnard College, Miss Spivey explained that Barnard, which she wrote on the blackboard, was the sister school of Columbia University, of which she expected we had all heard. Okay, so clearly, as with the camels, these kids just don't seem to know as much about Miss Spivey's background as she expects them to. Right, so she's telling them, hey, I went to Barnard College expecting a lot of respect. But Ralford hears that and he's like, what do you study at a barnyard college? He's not really getting it. So what does that illustrate in the story? Does it suggest that Miss Spivey has an exaggerated view of what information should be considered common knowledge? Yeah, that seems pretty on the nose, right? She thinks that everyone's heard of all the things she's seen, all the things she's been to, including Columbia University. She doesn't really back down from that. So I like that so far. B, establish a friendly dynamic between the charming school children and their indulgent and doting new instructor. I don't know how doting this new instructor is, or really how charming we're shown the school children to be. We've mostly seen the school children to be confused or bragging, and that's not exactly top of the list of charming qualities in my book. And again, Miss Spivey isn't like indulgent or doting. She doesn't condescend a whole lot to help out. She mostly just talks about how amazing her life is. To introduce Ralford as a precocious young student and Miss Spivey as a dismissive and disinterested teacher. Well, precocious, if you haven't heard that word before, it means you act older than you are. And Ralford isn't really punching above his weight class when he mistakes Barnard College for Barnyard College. He's actually missing the mark that Miss Spivey expects him to hit. And Miss Spivey doesn't really dismiss him, right? She explains what's going on. So I wouldn't say she's disinterested, and I certainly wouldn't say Ralford's precocious. Not stupid, just hasn't heard of Barnard College. D, demonstrate that the children want to amuse Miss Spivey with their questions. Is that what Ralford's doing? No, he genuinely seems curious, like he's actually confused. So I don't think they're doing that to amuse Miss Spivey. I think the issue here is that Miss Spivey has an over-realized idea of how much these kids are just going to know about where she's come from. So let's get into these broad questions, right? These according to the passage questions. The narrator of the passage can best be described as, well, so we'd have to look for clues here, right? We can't really look for it in the dialogue. We'd have to look for it more in the descriptions roundabout. Now, hard times were still upon us in 1938. So whoever's saying this is an us to the citizens of Three Step. And their mother is, all we know here is like their mother is still alive, right? So, okay, that's all we know from there. We know that whoever the narrator is has a little brother, Ralford, who's asking these questions. And then she continues to say, it was there that she told us in the midst of trying to find her true mission in life. So who she's telling? She's telling the class. So whoever's narrating this must belong to the class. We see it again here. We all hung there for a minute, thinking hard, waiting for us to be amazed. So whoever's giving this story is in the classroom as a student. One of Miss Spivey's former students, yeah, they are telling it sort of in past tense, so that might be the way to go. Miss Spivey's predecessor, well, no, that would be if the story were being told by the teacher that came before her, Miss Chandler here. Miss Chandler's not telling the story. An anonymous member of the community. I mean, I guess, but not really. They're not trying very hard to remain anonymous if they're giving the name of their little brother. They haven't given their name, but they're not, they're not like wearing a mask or anything. Miss Spivey herself. No, I don't think Miss Spivey would talk about herself in the way that this story talks about her. And certainly Miss Spivey doesn't have a little brother named Ralphard who asks her questions. So this is definitely one of Miss Spivey's former students looking back and telling the story. Remember, we know this is being told like in the past tense. Hard times were still upon us, like back in 1938. Now, in the passage, three-step is mainly presented as, well, where do we see three-step mentioned? We see it up here, which doesn't really say much. We know that it's in Georgia. We know that it gets hot in the summer, right? Based on these passages. Probably the most telling thing about three-step. Oh, and we know that they're suffering here in 1938. We know that times are hard in 1938. And here she describes three-step sort of in a back doorway. She wanted to bring democracy and education to the poorest, darkest, most remote, and forgotten corner of America. And they sent her to three-step Georgia. So the insinuation there is that three-step is, not only a poor place, but it's actually a very forgotten place. It's remote. It's sort of distant from any resources. So is it a summer retreat for vacationers? No, summer in three-step is literally described as hellish. So I wouldn't give that. A small rural town? Yeah, most likely. Let's see if we have any better ones. Town that is home to a prominent university. Well, no, if they knew what universities were, and if they had a university, they probably would have teachers coming out of that university, right? Rather than all the way from Barnard. A comfortable suburb? Oh, no. No, these people are not comfortable. So yes, a small rural town seems to be our best option. What do we have left? All we have is number 8. So according to the passage, Miss Spivey ended up in three-step as a direct result of what? Well, why did she end up in three-step? Again, we find out that she gave this information to the WPA. This is where I want to serve, in these dark, remote, forgotten corners. They sent her to three-step, they being the WPA. So as a direct result, now this is clear. That's important because, lots of things could have led to it, but we're looking for the closest, sort of the shortest line of causality. A, her friendship with Janet Miller. Well, Janet Miller gets mentioned like way back here. And while it was a fruitful intermission, I don't think it really leads to her going to three-step. B, attending college in New York City. Yeah, like, I guess. She goes to the teacher's college, and that's how she interacts with John Dewey, but that's not a real short line. I don't know about that one. C, talking with a woman at the WPA. Yes, that is the direct result, right? She says to the woman, here's where I want to go, and the WPA says, here's where you will go. D, Miss Chandler's retirement from teaching. That just isn't clear here. Like, we know Miss Chandler came before her, but we don't know that, like, Miss Spivey isn't a community member, right? Who's hearing about Miss Chandler retiring and now moving in. It's more from this conversation with the WPA.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.